Let's begin. Welcome to this conversation on international financial architecture, innovation, and the Summit of the Future. I'm Richard Ponzio from the Stimson Center and Global Governance Innovation Network, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this discussion, timed to coincide with this week's spring meetings of the World Bank and IMF here in Washington. And as many of you are also aware, in 5 months' time will be the potentially, but we are believing in the history-making Summit of the Future, scheduled for 22 and 23 September at the start of UNGA High-Level Week in New York City, of course. Now, two of our distinguished speakers today are zooming in from New York, and two are also active in this week's spring meetings here in Washington, D.C. Over the next 75 minutes together, we will explore ways in which exchanges on international financial architecture reform within New York and Washington, D.C., alongside national capitals, could be made more complementary, reflecting on, for instance, negotiations underway in New York since December on the main outcome document of the Summit of the Future, the Pact for the Future, and to compare this and even contrast it against related discussions here in Washington at the World Bank and IMF executive boards. More specifically, we'll delve into chapters 1 and 5 of the draft Pact for the Future, which currently speak to how a strengthened and innovated World Bank and IMF can help countries to better deliver on the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and Paris Climate Agreement, and then juxtapose this New York-based conversation alongside similar reform efforts here in DC, shepherded by the relatively new World Bank President Ajay Banga and his IMF counterpart Kristalina Georgieva. Now, before I have the pleasure to introduce our esteemed panel, I wish to first give the floor to my colleague Nudara Yusuf. Many of you know as executive coordinator of the Global Governance Innovation Network and co-chair of the 2024 UN Civil Society Conference on the Summit of the Future. She'll share a few words and some links in the chat box. Be looking at the chat box during today's discussion on a new outcome report from the recently held Africa Summit of the Future Dialogue in Abuja, as well as next month's Nairobi conference. Nudara.
Thank you so much, Richard. And it's a pleasure to join this discussion today that will be an insightful one on connecting DC, New York, and global discourses more broadly. We're particularly excited that this comes right off the back of a regional policy dialogue that the Global Governance Innovation Network was a partner for, called the Africa We Want and the United Nations We Need, hosted by the Savannah Center for Diplomacy, Democracy, and Development in Abuja, Nigeria, from the 4th to the 6th of March. Besides the Savannah Center for Diplomacy, Democracy and Development and the Stimson Center, some 20 organizations partnered on this Africa-wide dialogue and sought to feed crucial African perspectives into the Summit of the Future. And it will also be promoted at tomorrow's Africa Futures Forum, hosted by the US Institute for Peace and other partners here in Washington, DC and globally. But on the associated, it will also build on the associated Abuja Declaration and the Africa Regional Think Tank Network that was set up at this dialogue. All of this will also be shared at the upcoming UN Civil Society Conference in support of the Summit of the Future, which will take place from the 9th to 10th of May at the UN office at Nairobi. As a couple updates on where we are on that front, there are already some 4,000 registrants and many are being approved and accepted to join us in person. Many others will be encouraged to join us online. These registrants come from 146 different countries, including 43 member states that have registered 22 UN agencies, and over 40% of the cohort that have registered to join us in Nairobi are between the ages of 18 to 35. So we have a really intergenerational conference, which will produce an impact for the future as its outcome document. Day 1 will focus on thematic workshops. Day 2 will focus on impact coalitions, which will be a key outcome of the conference. To find out more about both the Nairobi conference and how to get engaged in person or online, do join us on the 23rd of April from 11:30 a.m. to 1 p.m. New York time for a town hall that the UN Department of Global Communications will be hosting. We'll put more information in the chat box. Thank you so much, and over to you, Richard.
Thank you, Nudara. And I'm pleased to also note here that in June, we'll bring out our annual Global Governance Innovation Report on the theme Achieving Human Security Through a New Global Economic Governance Architecture. And we'll further convene a related global policy dialogue on this very theme at the ACANS annual meeting this June in Tokyo. Please also see the chat box for further details on how you can register. Turning now to our distinguished speakers, where I'll give only the briefest of introductions in the interest of time. I'm pleased to welcome to our panel Her Excellency Ambassador Antje Lindertse, Permanent Representative of Germany to the United Nations and co-facilitator of the Pact for the Future negotiations. She is joined by her fellow Pact co-facilitator, His Excellency Neville Gertz, Permanent Representative of Namibia to the United Nations. Next, I'm pleased to introduce His Excellency Chibamba Kanyama, Ambassador of Zambia to the United States. He's also a former senior International Monetary Fund official here in Washington, and this week, including this morning, accompanying his Minister of Finance of Zambia to the World Bank and IMF spring meetings here in DC. Finally, and also active in the spring meetings this week in Washington, we're delighted to have as part of this conversation Her Excellency Alexia Latortu, Assistant Secretary for International Trade and Development from the U.S. Department of the Treasury. We'll begin this moderated discussion with 2 rounds of questions on our overarching theme, first beginning purposely broad, but then drilling down in the second round to more specific proposals under consideration in both Pact for the Future negotiations, as well as related discussions here in Washington. We anticipate then having around 25 or so minutes at the latter part of our program to hear from many of you, so please do begin to ponder any succinctly focused questions you may wish to pose to our panel via Zoom's Q&A function. We'll also be sharing those updates in the chat. We're also encouraging you to include your name and where you're viewing this session from. So let's get this conversation started with Ambassador Lindertse. How would you describe both the significance and main reasons for the timing of this September Summit of the Future at the start of UNGA High Level Week, since we'll zero in soon on the UN's relationship with the international financial institutions here in DC, you're encouraged to first speak to the summit's broader goals and themes. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard, and thank you for having me. And on timing, I start with the timing question. Of course, here in New York, usually you have all the heads of states of government or their representatives, but mostly heads of states of government you have here in New York in the 3rd week of September. So we're making use of their presence, and it is foreseen that we have the Summit of the Future here in New York at the UN September 22nd and 23rd. So just before the so-called high-level debate starts, and when we have them all here. So this is timing, a very practical reason. And also have, if I come now to your substantial questions on substance, what are the issues that will be discussed in the Pact, or that will encompass a chapeau? It will encompass a chapeau and 5 chapters. The first issue is sustainable development and financing for development. The second issue is peace and security. The 3rd chapter is on science, technology, and innovation and digital cooperation. We have a 4th chapter we're talking about with the membership and the member states, which is youth and future generations. And the 5th one is the chapter that maybe brings the most of the deliverables, which will be transforming global governance. And this is exactly the chapter where also international and financial institutions are dealt with, or there may be called for reform of the global international financial architecture, including, of course, the governance we have here. So you can see a large variety of topics is at hand, and I see 2 broader goals. One you already mentioned is that we are struggling, all are struggling. The globe, developing, but also developed states are struggling with the implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals. And of course, one of the issues is how to finance a better implementation. And it's not only a financing question, I have to say. It would be also a question of taking better use of digital opportunities, for example, or many other boosting effects or leverage we have to implement the Sustainable Development Goals. But this is, of course, a topic in the Pact, how to show ways on how to act better, more efficiently and more future-oriented in order to make the SDGs a reality. And maybe a second point, we are aiming for a better way to interact with each other. This is the call for better and improved and updated multilateralism. We have to work on steps to adapt the way of multilateral cooperation with the UN, through the UN, but also within the UN at its center to today's and tomorrow's reality. So this could be taken, could be by taking the voice of youth better into consideration and by prioritizing prevention or by strengthening the cooperation and the interaction between the IFIs and the UN. So these are the topics at hand we are dealing with.
Thank you, Ambassador. I'd say, especially the overview, the two main goals, emphasis on youth, and giving us that brief snapshot of the structure of the Pact for the Future and zeroing in on Chapter 5, which I think is going to definitely be at the heart of our discussions today, transforming global governance and specifically IFI reform. On that note, let's transition to the topic at hand with Ambassador Kanyama. How do you see the Summit of the Future alongside current reform efforts where you are in Washington, D.C., and your former institution, the IMF, as well as the World Bank? How do you see this addressing the global financial and economic governance gaps, which were clearly identified in that 10-page critical document from last year's UNGA high-level meeting at the SDG Summit in its political declaration?
Thank you very much. The first thing is that the IMF, World Bank, have been responding to the pressures to reform for a number of years now. And they have tried to. I think the World Bank has moved much faster to reform. The International Monetary Fund has been a little slower. I think the major changes in the IMF in terms of reforming its approaches, how to meet the demands of the world happened under Ms. Christine Lagarde and accelerated under the leadership of the current MD. I do remember in 2014, I was actually the team lead for the IMF Global Opinion Survey, the first ever, where we sent questionnaires to various stakeholders across the world, 66,000 of them sent. Of course, the response was just about 8,000. That was good enough for us to make our conclusions. And two things came out. I mean, a lot of things, of course, but two things that talk about the need for reform made from the survey, particularly from the civil society organizations. And they all were on one word called even-handedness, that IMF was not sufficiently even-handed. On one front, not even-handed in the treatment of developing countries, Latin American countries, African countries, that it didn't favor them in terms of its policy framework, particularly where access to funds. Hardly any African country would access more than $1 billion or $2 billion US dollars at a given time when in need. And they thought that other countries like Ukraine were accessing 10 times more. So they didn't think IMF was even-handed in that front. And two had to do with representation. That you have a Southern African executive director on the IMF board representing about 24 countries. And these countries don't share some things. They're experiencing difficulties which are different, which are unique to each country. So the feedback then helped to define the kind of reform that the IMF had to undertake. And there was so much collaboration between the two, the World Bank and the IMF, on what kind of changes, reforms must take place. And I'm happy to talk about some of those reforms a little later, but I can highlight one or two things. The perception of the IMF before then was that it imposed its own policies on countries. It imposed itself. It determined the conditionalities. From 2015, you realize today the IMF no longer imposes conditionalities to borrowing countries or on its own programs. The countries and the IMF agree on the key targets And then the country has come up with its own homegrown policies, its own kind of conditionalities that are that reflect its own priorities. And that's why a country like Zambia, which I represent today, which is under an IMF program right now, it determined its own conditionalities. That's why for the first time in the midst of an IMF program, Zambia is able to recruit. That was taboo years past, to recruit civil servants, teachers, nurses, when you are undergoing an IMF program, continue with social cash transfers to the most vulnerable. That was taboo before then. To continue to subsidize in a way those who are vulnerable to facing pressure on energy, on agriculture inputs. So I think there has been some kind of change reflecting the feedback from the various stakeholders on most of these institutions, particularly the International Monetary Fund. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Kanyama, and especially the insights that you just shared from the, if I understand it, from our earlier meeting last month, quite an unprecedented survey with civil society on issues around IMF reform that you oversaw during your time at the IMF. Turning now to Assistant Secretary Latartu, who we're very fortunate is part of this conversation, having been a former senior World Bank and EBRD, European Bank for Reconstruction Development senior official, but drawing now further on your current day job, it's heavily involved in tracking the developments in the multilateral development banks. What do you see, generally speaking, as the respective strengths and roles of the United Nations and the international financial institutions, or IFIs, as they're often referred to?
Thank you so much for convening us, Richard. Really important conversation. Let me start with the obvious. If we did not have the United Nations, if we did not have the international financial institutions, we would need to create them, because the multitude of complex, scary, big problems that countries are facing today absolutely requires robust, strong, innovative, agile, transparent, accountable, multilateral institutions. To not only deal with the challenges, but also very much to identify and seize on the opportunities. I insist on this a bit because challenges there are, and we must face them in a resolute fashion. But if we miss opportunities, we won't be able to leapfrog into a new generation of progress. So want to stress that point. Now, this being said, of course, not all multilateral institutions are the same. The one commonality is that they must all evolve to meet the moment of today. And they must evolve in a way where they're quite cognizant of where they fit into the broader ecosystem and how and best they can add value, because they each have different mandates, they have different technical expertise, different comparative advantages, and different relationships with both the public and private sectors in any said country. And so I often say that coordination is not about doing the same thing together. It is about being complementary to each other. And so with that, let me just give you a few elements of responses, Richard. So the United Nations is critically important in setting the framework for sustainable development in an ambitious way, right? So the global collective agenda of the Sustainable Development Goals remains our North Star. The means for financing countries' achievements of this goals, the Addis Ababa Action Agenda, remains, I think, very, very relevant. Within that clear frame, the international financial institutions offer financial expertise as financial institutions. They offer the ability to engage in a truly respectful way in policy dialogue. So the example of the ambassador from Zambia, where there really is a dialogue with the countries. They provide knowledge products, they provide technical assistance. So it's not just about financing, as the ambassador from Germany said. These other pieces are also very important. This said, in 2023 alone, the 5 multilateral development banks that the US is a member of provided more than $145 billion in assistance, and that's critical. And then the concessional windows of these institutions are particularly critical for the most poor countries, the countries the most affected by fragility and conflict. And we have some important replenishment meetings this year for both the World Bank, International Development Association, and the Asian Development Fund. And so that sort of financing operational role is where the MDBs fit in. So I think what's really important, Richard, is for there to be greater understanding and awareness from the UN and the IFIs about what they're doing. I was in New York just 2 weeks ago and met with several permanent representatives, the SIDS group, the Africa group. And what's clear is that I think the IFIs and shareholders of the IFIs are not doing our jobs well enough in terms of trying to articulate the ways that we're trying to be responsive, and the IFIs are trying to be responsive to what countries are saying. And I think also at the capital level, I need to, from a finance ministry, engage more with my colleagues from foreign affairs and vice versa, so that we understand priorities and understand how each piece of the ecosystem can best play its part. Last word, I think there's a particular place where the collaboration and coordination between the UN and the IFI system is particularly important. And that's in the too many countries that are affected by situations of fragility, conflict, and violence. For the IFIs to stay engaged, which is something they're getting more comfortable to do in these situations, they absolutely need deep partnerships with different parts of the UN system. We can pretend it's not political, but it is political often in situations of fragility. We need innovation to understand the drivers of facility. We need innovation to deliver basic services in these situations. We need innovation to monitor and consult with people of those countries in fragile situations as well. And that, I think, is a particularly promising place for UN-IFI collaboration.
Thank you so much. And I'm thrilled that you got to the critical area of fragility, conflict-affected situations. That was a third question I was going to pose to you if there was time, but I imagine we're going to save that time for audience participation. Don't forget your questions in the Q&A box of Zoom. But building on Assistant Secretary Latoure's response just now, Ambassador Gertz, how could the different multilateral cultures and orientations that are quite well known between New York and Washington, D.C., with, for instance, UN diplomats reporting to their ministries of foreign affairs, the executive boards of the IMF and World Bank working with their Ministry of Finance equivalents, how could this be bridged to forge a more coherent, networked, and effective system of global financial and economic governance? In particular, this proposal the Secretary General put forward in his Our Common Agenda being discussed now with the Summit of the Future, a biennial summit for the global economy.
Thank you, Richard, and thank you also for the input already heard from the rest of the panelists. I appreciate this conversation. Assistant Secretary has just touched briefly on your question to me as well, because when she speaks about being complementary in our efforts, I think this is precisely what we need. I often look at multilateralism as a choir or as an orchestra where different voices have to come together, complementing each other in producing then beautiful sounds. And the expected outcomes that we are looking for in this process certainly requires the various actors in the process to come together. So there is no question that the negotiations for the Pact for the Future demand a whole of government approach in all UN member states. As it will be agreed at the highest level, each country's government has to work out consolidated and coherent instructions to their delegations. It is our task as co-facilitators to make sure that the final results take into account the points raised by all 193 member states. And so in that case, I do believe that between the finance ministries and the foreign ministries and other participants in the process, we need to have a closer coordination of our efforts. I do believe that at local level, in each parliament or in each cabinet, these ministers do get an opportunity to brief their colleagues on what they are doing. And of course, for us in the foreign ministries, we would like to see a stronger collaboration, a stronger interaction than not only between governments, but indeed between us as governments and the IFIs, and particularly with the Bretton Woods institutions, as we are all seeking to address the same objectives in fast-tracking the implementation of the SDGs and dealing with new and emerging challenges that we are facing. So for me, it is simply a short answer that we need a whole-of-government approach for all UN member states in this process.
Thank you, Ambassador Gertz. So turning to our second round of questions, which I said earlier, we'll drill down into more specific proposals, specifically those under consideration within the framework of the Summit of the Future. So if we can stay with you, Ambassador Gertz, in what specific ways are diplomats in New York through, as we've been discussing today, chapters 5, but probably also chapter 1, currently exploring ways to reform the IFIs and improve international debt mechanisms? More specifically, are we likely to see, for instance, targeted calls for increased lending capacity in the IFIs, reform of voting rights and decision-making roles, and thirdly, concrete ways to strengthen information sharing and transparency among all creditors and borrowers?
Well, yes, indeed. We are currently dealing with these issues quite in depth. We have just gone through the reading of the zero draft and looked at inputs from member states as we are now preparing for the revised version. What we can say as co-facilitators is one thing for certain, that we want the revised version that we will be coming out towards, hopefully, towards the middle of May. We want that version to be ambitious and action-oriented. But that said, we must acknowledge that the conversations on IFA reform and international debt mechanism is of great importance to member states, in particular as it has bearing on their ability to implement the SDGs more effectively. This conversation has gained significant traction and cannot be brushed off as a purely Washington-based discussion. Developing countries face significantly worse terms of access to both long-term and contingency financing. On debt levels and tighter financing conditions have culminated in greater debt service burdens, liquidity, and solvency risks. The reality is that some developing countries dedicate more than 20% of their total revenue to servicing public external debt alone. For the case of Africa, African governments are reducing their spending on education to service debt. The reality is that inequalities embedded in the IFA contribute to a vicious cycle of debt for many developing countries. And this is strongly felt in African countries, but broadly in developing countries. This is not only unacceptable, but unsustainable if we are serious about achieving the SDGs. The Summit of the Future presents a once-in-a-generation opportunity to rebuild the IFA from the ground up and equip it with the legitimacy and resources to handle today's economic, social, and environmental challenges. And this is what we are hearing in the room. This is what is communicated to us, both with an appreciation and understanding that it is not easy, but it needs to be done. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Gertz, especially wearing your co-facilitator hat, but you're also a African ambassador, and your fellow ambassador from Zambia, Ambassador Kanyama. You mentioned earlier wanting to go down into a bit more detail on specific reforms that are under consideration in the executive boards of the bank and the fund. But I'd like you to tailor your response to the financing for development agenda. You know, there's a 4th international conference next year in Spain. There's a forum of the FFD coming up in May in New York. specifically, what changes could we see within the multilateral development banks and the IMF, but also the G20, very important convening platform led by Brazil and President Lula this year? How could it help speak to these couple of the big numbers we've been hearing about lately in connection with the Summit of the Future? Antonio Guterres calling for a $500 billion per annum SDG stimulus fund. Also from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, saying that we're well beyond that $100 billion a year commitment from Copenhagen back in 2009, public and private resources. We now need in the estimation of $300 billion per annum just for the critical issues around climate adaptation. Oh, and please kindly unmute yourself.
Yeah, thank you. Right, thank you very much. May I just first of all comment on the question you asked the ambassador? In terms of, I thought that was a really critical question on the transparency among creditors and borrowers on the debt issues. That's a very fundamental, especially when you look at the journey some countries in Africa have traveled lately. The past 5 years been very traumatic, and much of the high debt crisis facing most countries is not even fully ascertained. Why? It's because been lack of transparency, lack of knowledge, even among the creditors as to how much they lend to an individual country. Among themselves, been very poor collaboration. And just to make a debt assessment of how much is owed has taken another cost of hiring experts to help a country just to understand how much it owes different creditors. You're talking about official creditors here. Most of them are bilateral creditors. You're talking about the commercial market. These are sovereign debt creditors to most of these countries, and then individual commercial banks. These are individual commercial banks. And within here, you find a cocktail of what's offered. And it's concessional loans. Others are really market-based loans to these countries. And just harmonizing this has been very, very difficult. But for a country like Zambia, the G20 helped in a very big way. And I think this is one platform where you find solutions can come about. The involvement of the G20 in trying to unpack and help countries get debt relief. Coming into your question on how do we finance the future in terms of financing for development? How can we realize all those billions that are required for climate change? I think it's a hybrid, first of all, understanding who can come to the table. And this is where I say there are different players who must be brought on board, provided sufficient reforms take place. The private sector, these are individual creditors, not even creditors, but financiers, people who want to be philanthropists and support a good initiative like this. Private sector that has been blamed for the offshoots of climate change, the negative impacts of climate change. We've been collaborating with quite a number of them here within Washington, D.C. And you realize that they are willing to come on board to support. We are talking about billions of US dollars. So you have to really understand what kind of collaboration is required. Like I heard earlier that the need for complementary efforts is not really just about bilateral, it's multilateral complementary efforts. Multilateral here refers to a blend of financing institutions that are willing to come on board, others offering soft loans, concessional loans, others are practicing philanthropic work, just making their contributions, others offsetting what they are doing in terms of damaging the climate. And this is the private sector. And we know that most of those are coming on board. But in terms of specifics on what kind of reforms are required to bring them on board, maybe I can outline that a little later. Thank you.
Great. We'll definitely come back during Q&A. And I'm so glad that you did build on Ambassador Gertz's comment about management of international debt challenges in the Zambia context, because as many on this call know, Zambia is in many ways a case study for how traditional creditors, the public sector contributors associated with the Paris Club, can work with new and emerging donors, in particular China these days. Ambassador Lindertze, building on Ambassador Kanyama just now, Ambassador Gertz's specific concrete ideas that are being explored by member states, especially in connection with the Pact for the Future. I was wondering if you could speak to any under-addressed issues thus far. Of course, there's a million, but in particular, we're hoping to give a little bit more light about the IMF's role, the really high-profile discussions around quota formulas for decision-making, also involves, of course, China and other countries, as well as proposals to issue the IMF's special drawing rights more regularly and at greater scale, really learning from the use in innovative ways in recent years coming out of the pandemic.
Yeah, thank you. But you're putting me, of course, in a difficult position because we're still negotiating between the different camps of interest and the different viewpoints and also perspectives that you could have on the questions you were raising. Maybe I would just say two things. One thing is all the issues you were mentioning are on the agenda, of course, and we have still 4 months to go in the negotiations. There are different perspectives, as I said, and there is also this question that the UN Secretary General raised when he was asked in February about the priorities for the Pact for the Future, and he was pointing to the fact that, of course, the decisions concretely are not made in New York, but to have the heads of states of government of 193, and this includes, of course, all the shareholders, all the groups that have their say in the IMF and World Bank and others. It's important, I think, for us in the negotiation process to see that the heads of states and government in the actual pact then will give direction, will give messages from New York that are, of course, ideally bringing forward the 2 goals I was mentioning in the beginning, which is the boosting the implementation of the sustainable development goals, but also secondly, what both my co-facilitator Neville Gertz said, or also Ambassador Kanyama. The issue is, of course, also a kind of not only harnessing the potential we have because of a better global coordination, better cooperation between all the IFIs and the UN, but also the question of a better understanding where we in the future have a common interest to go to if we define ourselves, or it's not for me to say, I mean, I'm the co-facilitator, permanent representative, but the heads of states of government define where they have an interest to more closely coordinate also for their demands, but also visions for the future of this global economic governance system, if you put it like that. And maybe it's enough to point to the directions and not to go in this negotiation phase in the concrete questions you were raising. Thank you.
Thank you. No, and I know there'll be many more questions looking for those details from our partners across civil society watching today's conversation, but we completely understand the situation and facilitating the rich exchange of views that have been enunciated in today's exchange. Returning now to Assistant Secretary Latortu, like your first question, it's a pretty broad, not even weighty question, but you're just the person to pose to, and that is, how can we help countries derive more impact from the development finance they borrow, especially in light of falling growth rates that we've seen compared to previous decades, even with all the stimulus of coming out of the pandemic. We're not seeing the same growth rates of just a short decade or so ago. But more generally, how can we increase the global system's effectiveness in delivering better outcomes for developing countries and emerging markets?
Yes, thank you for that big question. No, I mean, I think it's clear that the development finance system needs to evolve to meet 21st century challenges, the challenges that are resulting in some of the statistics that you cited, the waning growth growth numbers in parts of the world. And what we've observed, and Secretary Yellen, I think, was very clear in launching a call for the evolution of the development banks, is that there's certain big global challenges that no one country can sort of solve on its own, but that is actually already reversing hard-won development gains. The changing climate is one of them. Again, I met with a lot of SIDS, representatives of the SIDS in New York. It's existential and real. The pandemic, recovery from the pandemic has been unequal and uneven. And certainly, again, fragility and conflict, we see as well countries that are spending a greater percentage of their budgets on security because of rising violence and conflict. And so the system needs to evolve so that it can help countries tackle these regional global challenges so that we can have sustained progress on poverty reduction and inclusive, resilient growth. And we think there are 4 pillars to do this. And when I say we, there is a broad coalition of shareholders of the development finance system. The World Bank has 189 members, so it's a broad coalition, have been working on this intensively since late 2022. The first one is around vision, updating the mission and vision of these institutions to acknowledge that what they need to do is also to address these global challenges that impact the poorest countries and most vulnerable populations first and foremost. And so we've seen, for example, the World Bank update its mission statement to ending poverty on a livable planet. The second pillar is around incentive structures. You can't just change a mission statement. You need to really hardwire what you're trying to do throughout all the incentives of the institution, right? So that's very much about integrating global challenges in all the country diagnostics and the country engagement model of the institution. And it's also recognizing that for countries that need to bear the cost of dealing with some of these global challenges, even though the benefit is for the region or the whole world, maybe the global community needs to help provide some incentives in terms of greater volume, better pricing, longer tenures to that as well. So working with the World Bank, for example, on a framework for financial incentives for projects that have cross-border impacts. Thirdly is the operational approach. We need to sort of change and improve the toolkit of these institutions. So for example, the World Bank released a new crisis response toolkit that includes, speaking of debt that Zambia mentioned, debt resilient debt clauses as part of the toolkit. It's also about really making sure that these institutions leverage their balance sheets to mobilize private capital, because public funding alone will not be enough. Also looking to whether there's measures of vulnerability that can be incorporated in allocation decisions. I think that's still work that's being piloted, but that's one of the areas that we're talking to the institutions about. And then, of course, financial capacity. So it's not all about financing, but financing matters. And so boosting the financial capacity of these institutions, following on the G20 capital adequacy report recommendations, we've seen the system of MDBs boost their financial capacity by around $200 billion over the next 10 years by responsibly stretching their balance sheets, so maintaining the AAA, but also stretching their balance sheets. We've seen the institutions offer new ways of getting financing available to countries. So for example, the African Development Bank was the first bank to issue hybrid capital to the private sector. I think that's a huge innovation that others can follow. We've seen the Inter-American Development Bank last month approve a new capital increase, but also new business model for its private sector arm, IDB Invest, that's predicated on an originate to share model where the MDB does not have to hold on to an asset, for example, an infrastructure project for the whole life of the project, but rather they're there at the beginning to originate structure when the risk is super high. When the risk starts to come down, the returns look more evident. They can share that asset with the private sector, freeing the MDB capital to do the riskier upfront work. So these are the 4 pillars that collectively we're working on, but not just at the World Bank, throughout all the development banks. At the IMF, we are pleased to have reached a decision on the 16th General Review of Quota, with a 50% increase in quotas and paved the way for the 25th chair from Sub-Saharan Africa at the IMF board, which I think will be important to the quality of the conversations, and very pleased that President Biden was able to authorize, sign bipartisan legislation authorizing the United States to contribute $21 billion to the Poverty Reduction and Growth Trust that provides concessional financing with policy reforms to countries. There's a whole agenda around climate. I think I probably have spoken too much, but I just want to underscore that the climate agenda is huge, and that includes reviewing with the G20 Brazilian presidency, the climate finance architecture, so that the existing money can be spent with greater speed and effectiveness. So we're looking at easing the access to finance. Countries need sometimes capacity building projects just to access existing financing, about streamlining the procedures across the major funds, the Green Climate Fund, the Climate Investment Funds, the Global Environmental Facility, the Adaptation Fund, so that you don't have to have different processes each time. I think the work on the new quantified collective goal is really important to get that right. There's work happening right now on the arrangements for loss and damage, including the fund at the World Bank. So a very big agenda. Let me end on debt, because that's a critical piece of the equation. The Undersecretary for International Affairs, Jay Shamba, gave a speech last week that I hope you can look up, that talked about global debt and development, and acknowledged the fact that we're actually seeing financial flows on net out of low and middle income countries with a burden of debt repayments exceeding new financing. And such net outflows from low and middle income countries, particularly to official bilateral and private sources, are at multi-decades highs, right? And so we need to do work on debt, in my view, in three phases. Number one is preventing countries from having debt distress. And so all that work around technical assistance, good debt management is critical, transparency is critical. Secondly, for countries that are doing the right policy things, but are at the risk of falling into debt distress, we need the entire system, official, public, private, bilateral, domestic resources to step up to avoid those countries from falling over the precipice into debt distress. So we need the system to step up faster, bigger. And then, of course, thirdly, for countries already in debt distress, we need to improve the speed and the predictability of the debt restructuring process. Let me end there.
Thank you for taking on the challenge of that weighty question. You spoke brilliantly, very succinctly too, though, on issues that are very much at the heart of all these various UN processes that we're talking about. Summit of the Future, of course, but last year's SDG summit, if you look at the political declaration, the financing issue comes up first and foremost. And as noted, we've got the 4th International Conference on FFD coming up next year in Madrid. There's going to be an IDA 21 replenishment question coming up for you in a minute, Alexia, but I will give you a chance to contemplate, and the other panelists as well. Let me read off 4 top questions, which is probably all we're going to have time to, unfortunately. So we thank everybody who's made contributions, but we'll first hear from Ambassador Lindartse on, it's a pretty important and broad question. How can the IFIs, but I would also personally add in the UN's programs, funds, and agencies, support, coordinate, and learn from local civil society organizations? We recognize that many IFIs work to support governments, but it's also important to ensure that local civil society priorities are supported and considered. This is the whole localization debate, both in the humanitarian and development space. This is from Marina Kumskova from the Global Partnership for the Prevention of Armed Conflict. Next, we're going to hear, and so we'll come back to you in just about a minute, Ambassador Lindartse, and we kindly request relatively brief responses. Ambassador Chimbambe Kanyama, we have a question from the continent of Africa, Mr. Omandi Peter from the Kenya. He's from Kenya and he represents the Global Youth Forum. His question to you is, what is being done to ensure that young people across the globe have access to global funding for their grassroots development projects? As I mentioned, Assistant Secretary Latartu, we have a question from Carly Munelli of Save the Children. She asks, given that the full question is, one of the most important opportunities to development financing this year is the IDA 21 replenishment. Given that the U.S. was a top donor to IDA 20, and if you can explain IDA 20 and 21 at the beginning of your response, how could the U.S. support be crucial to building support for a bigger and better IDA among all donor countries. And then finally, so looking for US leadership in this space. And then finally, for Ambassador Gertz, we have Ambassador Mark Lagone, who's based here in Washington, D.C., asking a very focused question in the health sector. How does the health sector factor into the Pact for the Future and IFI's reform? Beyond even the pandemic accord negotiations, where we're in the final stage, and I assume we'll get a cross-reference in one of the chapters of the Pact for the Future. He specifically asked, though, as an example of reforms, in quotes, for the summit, or how do we make sure to leverage longstanding strong assets, such as the Global Fund to fight AIDS, tuberculosis, and malaria for health security? How central might the relatively new pandemic fund hosted by the World Bank be? Over to Ambassador Lindertze first, and then on to Ambassador Kanyama.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you very much. I was asked to be short, but of course, Nutara Yusuf, who spoke before we entered into the panel, gave some of the answers. I mean, it would be really good if every CSO, be it working on health or maybe even on economic questions, on financial architecture, could contribute to the Nairobi Civil Society Conference. There is a kind of interactive, it's not only she introduced it to you, this concept of having really messages that are already coordinated with the IFIs and also with the member states. So it will not be only from one point of the civil society, kind of very broad papers, but what they want to do is some very concrete input into this. And maybe a second answer to the question, because it was not only on the process, it was more in general. I come back to what Ambassador Kamyani said on conditionality and doing it together with the countries. So creating ownerships, of course, to enhance the ownership of the participate or the countries that are undergoing, for example, restructuring of debts or undergoing IMF programs. It would be very good to embrace or to factor in also the input of civil societies, because they see how it is used for the SDG implementation, and they probably will be on the side of the governments to say, let us not stop, for example, civil servant recruitment, or let us not have measures that are hurting the most vulnerables. So maybe that is two of my proposals to answer that question.
Thank you, Ambassador Lindartze. Over to you, Ambassador Kanyama. Oh, and please kindly unmute.
Thank you. I loved very much the contribution by Alexia, particularly when she mentioned the African Development Bank and its ability to lend directly to the private sector. And it has proved lately that the key source of financing for youth-initiated programs in agriculture and manufacturing, in almost every sector in Africa particularly, is from African Development Bank. They've really been giving quite substantial concessional financing to the private sector, and much of that is led by young people. So, Mr. Peter, that is one. And there's also been private initiatives, other private sector-led financing from developed countries, particularly in the tech startups. This is in Kenya, Nigeria, and in Rwanda. We're trying to propel that in Zambia now, where there's angel investors, dangerous for young people. But we also have venture capitalists who are trying out the continent now to finance different initiatives. Most of these are led by young people. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Kanyama. Back to you, Assistant Secretary Latartu.
Thank you. So yes, IDA, the International Development Association, is the part of the World Bank group that lends to the 70 plus poorest countries in the world, including the most fragile and conflict affected countries. So it's a super important source of concessional loans and grants, pure grants, to those countries. It's replenished because it's concessional and grants. Donor funding needs to come back into this fund every 3 years. It's replenished. So IDA 20 was the previous 3-year replenishment that actually was accelerated with the existence of COVID, donors stepped up and actually replenished the fund after 2 years. And this year, in 2024, IDA 21 is the next 3-year cycle of funding that's being negotiated right now. The U.S. was proud to be the largest funder in this last replenishment during the critical time of COVID, and this replenishment remains equally important for the reasons that we've all been discussing. Important in terms of the outcomes it will help to drive. So I'm really glad the question said better and bigger, because I think you do need both. The better part is where the impact will come for countries. And so the US has 3 main priorities for this replenishment. The first one is around really using IDA for better debt transparency, sustainable finance, including helping countries with domestic resource mobilization. The second is around helping IDA continue to help countries face these global challenges that are, affecting every sector of the society that I mentioned: climate, pandemics, and health systems more broadly, as well as fragility and conflict. And then thirdly is innovating around IDA's financial model, because a couple years ago, IDA actually started going to the markets to be able to leverage its track record to increase financing. So now it's funded partly by donors, partly through financial innovations, and making sure that we have that financial model built well to both maximize funding, but also to do it in a financially sustainable way, and in a way where we can still provide sufficient grants to those countries who need it, is a very big priority for us. So engaging with civil society, with the countries themselves, to really define the most ambitious policy and financing package for IDA 21 as a top US priority.
Great. And as we turn to Ambassador Geertz on his question, let me just note to our panel, we'll give you a chance for any final relatively brief summing up reflections. In particular, this running theme that's come up in several of the questions, especially what we're seeing via the Q&A box, just about civil society engagement, NGO advocacy organizations, social movements, of course, academics and policy researchers, the quality of that engagement, in particular in connection with the Summit of the Future and with Nairobi around the corner, but also our friends here in Washington speaking to engagement as you have observed over the years, especially the IMF survey that Ambassador Kanyama referred to earlier for engaging civil society's views. Over to you, Ambassador Geertz, on the final question that was posed to you.
Richard, thank you very much. I think the list of critically important issues that member states and now that you have brought in the conversation around civil society and other stakeholders have brought onto the table already is quite long in terms of priorities that we would want to, that the stakeholders want to see in the Pact for the Future. Certainly health is a critical sector, but what we are as co-facilitators confronted with is that we do not want to duplicate efforts. There has to be inputs coming from those who are dealing with certain aspects that we would ultimately get from them. And for this, we know that under the emergency platform discussion, health is part of that. We know that the WHO is leading negotiations on the instrument on pandemic preparedness. So we would clearly see the outcome of those processes find its way into the final stages of our process so as to avoid duplication. And then also on the issue of civil society participation, I can categorically state that Ambassador Lindertz and I have opened ourselves to a large extent to listen to the voices of civil society in the process. As we are moving in each step of the way, we are going to go back and have a conversation with civil society and other stakeholders, including private sector, giving the ideas that we would hear, but would encourage member states to put on the table, as this is a complicated process where the inputs that the co-facilitators will be processing will be endorsed and submitted by member states. We are in fact committed this week on the 17th of April for a discussion with civil society virtually to have their reflections and to share with them where we are now with Rev 1, at least after the second reading of our zero draft, or rather of where we are at this point. So the update will be on 17th, and then we will in May continue to be in Nairobi for the UN Civil Society Conference, where we will too have an open ear for their inputs. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Gertz. And we will be putting in the chat box now the link that many are aware of. There was a newsletter that went out by the Coalition for the UN We Need and the Global Governance Innovation Network about the consultation that you and Ambassador Lendartse are hosting with civil society, the third or fourth in a series in this latest phase of the Summit of the Future, the official negotiation period. Of course, it's been going on even longer. We have only a few minutes left for Ambassador Kanyama. He has to be with his Minister of Finance for more bank fund spring meetings this week. So we'll give a chance for him to give his final words, and we'll bid adieu. Thank you, Ambassador Kanyama.
Right, thank you very much. I really enjoyed this. I wanted to stay on, but just to point very quickly, one just on the civil society and how its role going forward. If there have been any significant reforms in the past two decades within the IMF and World Bank framework and how it relates with civil society, it's really about how the two work together. Civil society and these two giant institutions. I always ask people, I said, look, now there's spring meetings taking place in DC. In 1990s, 1980s, you would see huge crowds of people outside there, civil society with placards demonstrating. Today, maybe just one or two you'll find. And I say, where are they? Where is civil society now? Where have they gone to? They are inside. Right now, they are inside and engaging with technocrats, engaging with policymakers, engaging with all these World Bank, IMF officials within the building, inside. They are part and parcel of the engagement process. And that's why even when IMF designs programs for different countries, the civil society plays a significant role. The IMF will never do anything without the voice and input from civil society. So they are part and parcel of this. And finally, again, within the concept of what has happened within the IMF in the previous years, before IMF called itself, it said IMF stands for it's mainly fiscal. In other words, it was just about economic issues. Today, IMF is able to talk about globalization, is able to talk about gender, able to talk about corruption, able to talk about inequalities, able to talk about corruption, even able to talk about youth. And this is the issue of Diamond Peter from Kenya about the youths. And you find that your own governments today will focus programs that favor the youth, and the IMF will be part of that. This shows you that the IMF has truly reformed from this kind of club only focused on balance of payments or fiscal deficits to everything else that had to do with sustaining livelihoods, including climate change. I thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Final words from Ambassador Lendartse and then Ms. Latartu.
Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity. And I just echo what we were talking about in the beginning of this conversation, which I really much enjoyed. We are living, and also future generations even more will be living in a world that is more complex than ever, more challenged and interrelated than ever. So everything we can do also, especially in the dialogue and in coordination between New York and Washington and the international financial architecture, international financial institutions, can only help to cope. And I very much agree, it's not only about meeting the challenges, but also harnessing the opportunities that are given by future developments and what our children and their children will face. I would say the more we can kind of contribute in September to a message that is forward-looking and also giving us the wiggle room to still be in the next Financing for Development Summit to be still more ambitious in this evolution / reform / revolution that is before us. I think we would both institutions or both worlds would really profit. So I can only say and benefit. So I can only say, let's be ambitious and let's be also patient in our coordination efforts to understand the other perspectives. Thank you.
Thank you for those very thoughtful concluding remarks. Assistant Secretary Latortu.
Thank you. I'd like to touch on leadership. We talk a lot about the deficit of trust. True leadership does not fester distrust, but builds trust. That requires humility to learn about other disciplines. And so the ambassador from Namibia was talking about health. We now have health finance ministry coordination. You know, we didn't know very much about health. We still don't in this ministry, but we have to learn. So humility to learn about other disciplines and know how to connect. It requires courage to talk simply, openly, and frankly. It requires grace to be able to disagree with civility in the pursuit of real solutions. So leadership, leadership, leadership.
Thank you so much. And to be fair, Ambassador Gertz, I know you spoke to the issue around civil society engagement, and along with Ambassador Lindertz have really been champions from the beginning of the coming out of the Our Common Agenda and the last 2 years of working on the Summit of the Future together. But did you want to share any further thoughts before we wrap up today?
It's as if Assistant Secretary knew I wanted to speak about leadership, and so she touched on that important aspect, particularly for us to strengthen the issue of building trust amongst ourselves as all the parties involved in this process. But I think in the end, we have to have also room for give and take. I think there is absolutely a need to understand each other from our different perspectives and see if we can move closer to a comfortable level where the global community as a whole benefits rather than being set back. Thank you.
Thank you once again. Unfortunately, we do need to wrap up. It's an incredibly busy week for all 4 of our panelists and so many on this call. Many of you I know are here in Washington for the Bank Fund. We do have the honor to bring back Nudara Yusuf, my colleague, for a brief synthesis of what we learned today.
Thank you so much, Richard. And I'm really a little bit, I mean, you give me an incredible panel and a very tough job of trying to summarize it. But thank you so much for the opportunity to come back in here. And just to say, by way of quick summary, I think it's worth thinking about, 2 big themes that emerged in this conversation. We touched on many, many things, but both Ambassador, Her Excellency Latorte and Ambassador Lindertz spoke to interactions and bridging gaps and working together in an evolving system across various different institutions. And I think Ambassador Gertz and Ambassador Kanyama spoke specifically as well to capacity building and different issues, both capacity building of actors and institutions themselves in the way that we function. And so, you know, across that, there are some areas of low-hanging fruit where it seems easier for us to coordinate and build capacity, whether that be, you know, coordination on peace and security issues or clear needs when we look at climate, education, poverty alleviation, and otherwise. But there's also the more complex issues of what we're likely to see in the future, whether it be in cyber technology and other spaces where these issues are going to come to the fold in a big way as well. And I think it's really interesting to see the interaction between these spring meetings, what we might see come out of September in the Pact for the Future, the Declaration on Future Generations, Global Digital Compact, and otherwise, and how this may all sit towards the evolving road, both in the 2025 FFD meetings in Spain and the road ahead in moving forward as well. Maybe also to, because I was prompted by that final question to come in a little bit on the civil society side of things, to elaborate on what Ambassador Lindertz said about what we're trying to do with the Nairobi Forum as well, in terms of multi-stakeholder engagement. What we're looking at is having a civil society convened space to bring in member states, UN institutions, philanthropies, and other actors who are all working on issues and have been working on these issues collectively to bring together these impact coalitions that can start a conversation that's joint, that shares messages in Nairobi on not just feeding into the Pact for the Future process. Yes, that's an important part of it, but also starting to set up what happens once we've agreed on language in September, because really that implementation is where this civil society, multi-stakeholder piece is going to be so critical for the road ahead. And it's great to have these networks started earlier on in an informal civil society convened space. So more on that, stay tuned, keep watching the space for what's coming in that direction. But in the meantime, just to say thank you so much for taking the time out of your very busy schedules to have this bridging the different fora style conversation today. Richard, back to you.
Thank you, Nidara. And since Nidara has just skillfully summed up our conversation, let me simply conclude by thanking all of you from across the world who've joined us today and contributing your thought-provoking questions, to our Stimson team behind the scenes for promoting and organizing today's program, and then perhaps most of all, our talented speakers from today's program, Ambassador Lindartse, Ambassador Gertz, Ambassador Kanyama, and Assistant Secretary Latartu. We deeply appreciate, as Nidara just noted, you taking the time to engage in this rich exchange, and we wish you much success, whether in your deliberations this week here in Washington and on the road, of course, these next 5 months to go to this September summit, a sometimes windy and far from straightforward road that importantly travels through Nairobi these next few weeks. And we look for energy, ideas, and support from across civil society, many of you who participated in today's program. Indeed, given what's at stake, we continue to look to your leadership, our panelists, and are inspired by your repeated calls for multilateral institutions to forge innovative partnerships with civil society to restore trust and renew the United Nations to keep pace with today's biggest global challenges. Thank you once again for your time. We look forward to seeing you soon.